Okay, welcome back to the Mindedness Revolution. I'm here with Dr. Baron Short. Baron, welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be here, Greg. Let's go episode 2, all in on the Mindedness Revolution, right?
The Mindedness Revolution continues in episode 2 here. Super excited about that. So last time, we basically introduced ourselves, talked about how we're clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, bridging that, and about how things are really mind blind from our perspective, which at the end we framed in relationship to the Enlightenment Gap. And so the Enlightenment Gap is the argument we don't have a good, big, broad philosophical framework for putting mind in relationship to matter. That's the ontology. Well, I keep saying that word, but that means it's the theory of reality. What do we mean when we say mind relative to matter? Don't have good frameworks for that. And there's a thing called science that reduces to physics, at least modern empirical natural science, basically sort of reduces to physics or is anchored to physics. And then how does that relate to our subjective experience of being in the world, subjective consciousness? How does it relate to our cultural justifications? Because in some ways physics comes from that. We're based on observation, and at the same time, we have the hard problem of consciousness, all that other stuff. So the Enlightenment Gap is the absence. It results in mind blindedness. And you and I are here to fill that in and bridge it with mindedness.
That's it.
So,
and that reminder for the folks that are not as philosophically inclined, if you're not aware of the philosophy and the metaphysics you're operating from, then it's just operating on you, right? So, as we're trying to become aware of mind blindness and learn to become minded and mindfully minded. And so part of that, arguably, as an examined human being, is to become aware of personal and collective views and justifications, so you know why you're operating from a certain place. So it is relevant for folks that go, I don't know about this philosophy stuff. Yeah. Absolutely.
Super important. And in fact, speaking for myself for a second, this may go to your training as well, though you maybe were more in some ways philosophically inclined or certainly existentially big picture. But I sort of got hooked into what I thought was science, and I thought science gave you the frame for this. And science basically says, okay, we're going to grab the world and we're going to empirically examine it. Okay. And then we'll test stuff, we'll build models, we'll try to eliminate alternative explanations, and then and it does do that, sort of. Okay. It does do that a lot, but it's still sitting in something, it turns out. Okay. It's sitting in a set of assumptions. And to the extent that it doesn't have a holistic picture, you then have to ask what those assumptions are. Okay. And I would argue you can't get a holistic picture on empiricism alone. And so UTOK argues that actually what you need is you need empiricism. And by the way, both first person and third person, we'll talk about that. But basically, you need to study data and be grounded in data. And then you need logical consistency. And then you need coherence at the level, or at least know if you don't have coherence. Okay. And when you zoom back, I call that the descriptive metaphysical system. Okay. The descriptive metaphysical system. Now, some people, my friend Jim Rutt says, I hear metaphysics and I reach for my pistol. Okay? So if everyone's like, oh, no, these guys are whoa or new age or all that. And certainly Jim Rutt does that. But let me at least has that reaction. Listen, you and I can wonder about the world out there and have different experiences that make us wonder whether naturalism is whole. But what we're just focused on here is naturalism. So that's not what the concern is at all. We're focused on naturalism in terms of we're not advocating for anything magical. We're trying to get the picture of naturalism correct. And that's what a descriptive metaphysical system is. And if you wonder whether or not we don't have a good descriptive metaphysical system, well, that's why we talked about the problems. Okay. So the big problem is the Enlightenment Gap. And then I devoted my life to this problem called the problem of psychology. Okay. And this is that problem of what the heck is my discipline? What really is it about? What's its ontological referent, or just the thing in the world? And when you look in and you say some people say it's about behavior, and some people say it's about mind, and some people say it's about just humans, and some people say it's about the entire animal kingdom, that means we don't know what it is, and that's amazing to me, really, that we don't have a good, clear picture. And what that diagnoses then is we lack a descriptive metaphysical system, and you get rid of metaphysics of it, just a good descriptive system of what we mean by matter and mind in the world. That's what we're missing. Okay. So that's our point in our bridge, and mindedness is going to play a big role in us enabling us. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of like what is a descriptive metaphysical system we're operating from. But I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or in relationship to that. I hope that that's pretty clear.
No, I think that that's spot on, and depending over time, would love to get feedback from listeners or viewers, and this will come up as we even get into things, as we get more and more into mindedness. But I think you're spot on, and as you go through some of the layers of complexification, I definitely want to make sure later to take a moment to talk about the meaning of that, right? So, because it's one thing when it's a thing over there that doesn't really have any impact on me, versus I start to see through that type of naturalistic description and how it changes then how I see the world, and how I see others and how I see myself, right? And so we'll play with that a little bit too.
Totally. So today what I'd like then is that what we'll just introduce is a descriptive metaphysical system, get rid of a descriptive system for what we're talking about scientifically. And I would argue that this, my position, and I will debate anybody on this, this is actually the most comprehensive and coherent scientific description that we have of the world that includes us. Okay, so I'll say that again. It's the most scientific description. Okay, the most defensively scientific. All right. And well, what about people that are doing physics and mathematics? Yeah, and they would have more knowledge certainly of those domains than I do. But I'll tell you what, we got more knowledge of psychology and the social sciences. And they, although they have problems, quantum mechanics and general relativity, do they get along? They don't have anywhere near the conceptual problems that we do. Okay? We're in a whole nother ballpark when it comes with conceptual problems. We don't know what our subject matter is. They have matter and energy, and biology's got life. We don't have mind yet. So if anybody's trying to make an argument from a physics or a base philosophical kind of position, or even a neuroscience position, I'll argue, actually, you can't get through. You can't get through psychology, okay? So if you can't solve the problem of psychology, and the Enlightenment Gap is related to that, really the broader problems of the Enlightenment Gap, then you're in deep, deep trouble. And the tree of knowledge then gives us a scientific approach to solving the Enlightenment Gap. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about that because that's crucial to enable us to see mindedness in the world from a scientific perspective. And the story of this, certainly people in the UTOK land will know, I started with the whole psychotherapy. I thought I was doing cognitive behavior therapy. Then I realized, actually, the psychosocial process is really what's primary, meaning you need a legitimized healer. You need to come together, show respect, build a good relationship, get a shared understanding of where they are and what makes sense, use your expertise to enrich that understanding, see paths of adaptive behavior, which you might have expertise in, guide them in that, and to the extent that that catches, that's pretty much what psychotherapy is. And if you use the language of defenses and and unconscious, if you use the language of beliefs and values like cognitive therapists, if you use the dimensions of habits, etc., all that stuff actually sort of washes out. You get this big, broad, general common factor world. Well, actually, shouldn't we have habits and emotions and relationships and thought all tied together in our model of human psychology? Well, we should, but we don't. We have a problem with psychology. Okay. We don't have a framework for understanding. And I fell into this and started first with evolutionary psychology. And so evolutionary psychology is really interesting because it grabs psychology and then it jumps over to evolution, which means you then back in to the evolutionary history and biology, of course. And then in what's called big history is this, and I didn't know this at the time, but it's a big evolutionary view. We can think about the material universe as evolving. Certainly the basic model of the Big Bang suggests that we start at a particular place, the material universe evolves. So from 1994 to 1996 and 7, I was in this sort of historical evolution. I had developed this idea in 1996 about what divides us as humans. And then I was stoned one night in 1997. And this little diagram behind me popped out of my head. And that would become the tree of knowledge. And I argue that the tree of knowledge solves some really important descriptive metaphysical gives us a descriptive metaphysical system. It solves some serious descriptive metaphysical problems that we have faced. So what is this thing, the tree of knowledge? And basically it's a diagram of, and I'm going to use a math word here, it's the topology, which is basically sort of like, what's the interrelationship of complexification? And that's another, which is basically parts getting integrated to creating more complex wholes. Okay. And there has been a process of complexification from the Big Bang that we can start with us and we can trail that all the way back, just going back in time. Okay. And the tree of knowledge is a lens to see that. All right. That's what this affords. So I encourage folks, if you haven't seen it already, it's a graph, it's a depiction. And what it is these 4 upside down cones. Okay. And we can start with the knower that's like, I am a cone, I'm up here, I'm a cultured justifier. And the first cone is a cultured person that's self-consciously talking about itself. That's the first cone. Okay. And that network of complexification then came out of a cone beneath it, which I labeled mind. Okay. And we'll get into that in a second. And then mind came as a cone that came out of a cone beneath that labeled life. Life came out of a cone that's labeled matter. And then finally, you call it all down and you get down into energy. Okay. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about a map of complexification that starts with energy, goes over time, and jumps into 4 different planes of existence. So once we start with energy, we jump into 4 different planes of existence. We can now take, okay, now let's go back, and then I'll replay this from the vantage point of science. But let me just stop there, see if how that drops with you, Baron, see if there's anything you want to put into that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I would also emphasize and I believe you've talked about this in other places, but essentially the continuity and discontinuity, right? So
Totally.
There's a deep continuity of energy information through matter into life, into mind and culture, and to say there are discrete differences, but they also there's a deep continuity, and in that sense, like I am a matter object, a living organism, a minded animal, and a cultured person, and just taking a concrete example for a moment. I do see people that have, say, developed severe dementia, and it's tragic, but you watch the culture person
Totally
start to degrade.
Yep.
And there is still a minded animal. There is still a minded being there. And we would, for all clear purposes, say a human being. But it gets into, maybe not to go jump too far, but it gets into all the way from very early. When does a human organism have human cultured person rights? And human beings, if they're not of the right cultured person, when does society make decisions on their behalf, in terms of autonomy and beneficence? So again, these things can sound highly abstract and theoretical, but they actually have very practical groundings, right? And in a beautiful way, I think of those levels of complexification is attempting to unify, scientific realms, like at least in my training. So I was trained and learned, some basic physics and basic biology and, basic chemistry, but nobody said these are how these interrelate. That's up to you to figure out. And much less with the mind. Let's just kind of not talk about it, and that'll be a good start.
Right.
So again, trying to give people a framework so that as we think of the one thing I would say for our listeners is these are the building blocks for, as we get more and more into mindedness, it helps ground it, right? In ways that will become more apparent later. So that's
beautiful. That's exactly right. And by ground it, we can ground it actually in the hard natural sciences. And by hard, I mean that they're grounded in, there's a pretty damn good referent, that there's consensus that we can get around and argue about what's going on. And so let's start then from the beginning. The argument from standard physics, okay, our standard physics is at some level, the universe begins, and although there's some debate about this, a fair amount of consensus that we're talking about 13.8 billion years ago. And we should know this is our ontology, which means it's our best understanding of our own ideas, grounded in science about what the world is. So we have an ontology about the ontic. The world is the way it is, okay, independent of us, and we're trying to describe it. And physics gives us our best explanations for this domain. I will defer to the standard model in physics, standard cosmology. And it says that basically and I'm going to use it in quotes, Big Bang. So people need to know there's the Big Bang singularity model, which isn't super strong. But then there's the idea basically that if you factor out, if you go back in time, you can essentially vacuum out everything. That's matter, that's space, that's time, and you're left with an energy, I like to call it an energy-information singularity. Okay, and you can, and there's some debate about whether this actually happened. I think the evidence is overwhelming. You can't get physicists to consensually agree upon something without, these guys are super skeptical, hard-nosed individuals to get them all agreeing. There's a huge amount of evidence. There's what's cosmic microwave background radiation. You guys look into this. But essentially, if we vacuum everything out, okay, what we have left is a pure energy information singularity. That's the argument. Now, maybe that came from a black hole in another universe, that maybe there's continuous, maybe that is the beginning of time. There is debate about that. But from that, it creates then a continuity. Barron mentioned continuity. I'm working on a book with John where we talk about emergence. You have to think about it as the dialectic of continuity and discontinuity. Okay? The one and the many. It's a fundamental philosophical thing. Well, the one here, and this is what makes it very naturalistic, there's a one structure, an energy structure, okay, that begins the system. And I was just watching Our Universe, and they were all talking about actually energy is the thing that connects us all, okay? Mm-hmm. And we can actually then see that there's a chain reaction in the Big Bang, okay, chain reaction that results in a transformation, whereby you have this singularity, and all of a sudden what starts to form are different fundamental forces. Okay, so there's a differentiation then in the gravitational force and the strong nuclear force and the weak nuclear force residing then in relationship to electromagnetic radiation. So those four fundamental forces, if you ask people, are one of the fundamental real things in the universe. Okay, it's these fundamental forces, and they then give rise to, okay, the structure of particles, which in turn are going to give rise to the structure of atoms. And then essentially what happens is there's an expansion. Okay, so what you have initially are just these forces and their fundamental communications like photons. And then there's this differentiation. This differentiation actually causes a weird thing called the Pauli exclusion principle. That's what basically things like evolution, like an electron. And the nature of an electron is that essentially it can't occupy the exact same spot. Two electrons can't occupy the exact same spot. That's what and what that does is it gives rise to the explosion of a whole new dimension. I call that the matter. Trianon calls that the matter object dimension of complexity. And with it, we see this is where the point of the Big Bang is, and we see the explosion of space and time and all the galaxies coming out of this point. There are different ways to kind of frame the metaphysics of this and describe it, but this is the basic cosmological picture. And what UTOK says very clearly, which I sometimes think gets overlooked, is that we need to think about this collapse dimension and what it is relative to the matter dimension. And matter is rightfully described then. We could talk about particular points of matter, like is an electron a piece of matter, a fermion is a particular kind of matter. And then there's matter as a dimension of existence. There's a matter whereby quantum stuff is coalescing from decoherence to coherence, or coherence in the quantum probability into a decoherent macroscopic state. Okay? And there's big mysteries about exactly what. But anyway, just at a descriptive level, we have that jump. Okay? So the first thing here is we have an energy-information implicate order. That's the first layer. It's not even a dimension of complexification. It just reduces down into the one thing, zooming back through time. And then we have there's some chain reaction, maybe the finger of God, right? If you want to start with the finger of God, and then that chain reaction causes a phase shift so that all of a sudden those bosons, a boson is a technical term for like a photon, jump into fermions, but fermions can't occupy the same space and they create a massive expansion. The hot inflationary model is the standard model of the way in which we go from a collapsed state of energy information into a macroscopic or a state that's got matter, space, and time in it. Okay. So there's a huge amount of evidence for that. That's an empirical, mathematical set of arguments. Exactly what the metaphysics are at the beginning is one element. Then from there, we can then race through the eons for about 10 billion years, trail then get to our particular history, because that's where our frame of reference is. We're starting with us and looking back, and then we jump through and we see an evolution of complexification, meaning that parts come together. Within the matter dimension, there are basically, what happens is particles then jump together in the form of atoms to become stable wholes. So there's a primary unit for the matter object dimension. It's called an atom. Okay, the periodic table of the elements gives us that frame of reference. It's made up, of course, of particles, like a proton. It's actually got quarks inside of that, an electron. That gives you hydrogen. Somewhere, the vast majority of the universe is made up of mostly hydrogen. But in certain, and helium, about 75-25, a little lithium. But then stars coalesce, and then they form a particular furnace for heavier things like oxygen and iron, things along those lines. And ultimately, we get certain contexts like the surface of planet Earth that coalesces complicated chemicals. So a chemical then, basically, one way to think about it is a molecule, which is the joining of atoms. Okay, because there's a bond, and chemical bonding is crucial. And that gives rise to a whole new groups of atoms and become a particular kind of whole, a molecule. Okay? So inside the matter dimension, we have particles going to atoms, going to molecules across time. And that's the matter object dimension. Then we have at the particular planet Earth, and there's good debate about why this happens, but ultimately there's probably on planet Earth, the conditions are right for a prebiotic chemical evolution, meaning there's a propagation of certain kinds of self-replicating molecules and a certain energy matter environment that's conducive to that, which ultimately is going to give rise to a certain kind of selection, whereby there's replication, variation, and selection. And there's a jump there. This is the matter to life jump. And we can get into some of this. There's a great podcast. There's great books on this. All sorts of debate about where exactly it happens. I think we've narrowed this down so we have a pretty good sense about the steps. And ultimately, you're jumping here from elements like very large macroscopic molecules that are replicating into pre-organic structures, and then finally into cellular structures. So that's one of the great scientific mysteries, but that's how does life assemble? There's a good book recently on the stuff of life by Sarah Walker, and it's assemblage theory, which basically is about how complexification works. Then you get into cells. Cells are the fundamental units of life, and they carry information with them over time and across the generations. And that builds what we call the tree of life. And so the tree of life then is mapped by biology. And by the way, that's the natural sciences as we know them. Okay, so the natural sciences teach us about particles and atoms and molecules across scale. And they teach us about things like genes and cells and macroscopic organisms, and that have even things like brains. All of that fits into the normal pattern of our understanding. But that's really where the physicalism, like our understanding, well, after that, it gets really confusing. The tree of knowledge says actually what we should be paying attention to are patterns of behavior, okay? And when we think along those lines, what we see ultimately is a whole nother dimension of a pattern of a behavior. This is our home right here. We see the emergence of mindedness or mind animals, whereby out of it's called the Cambrian Explosion, there's a period about 530 million years ago. Happens in a very short period of time, at least speaking geologically, about 5 to 10 million years, whereby we go from simple planaria kind of worms. Those are worms like they have a little brain and they just move around and they feed on plants, to then things like crabs, okay, in about 5 million years. It's an amazing jump. What do we think happened? The best guess is that actually what happened was there was an evolution in prey and predation relation. So that ultimately you got carnivores, whereby animals started eating other animals. Okay. And when that happened, that created a massive adaptive problem whereby you had predators and prey, and that gave rise to the explosion of different kinds of body plans. Okay. And a brain that then was regulating the investment as whether a predator, a prey, or predation kind of structure. And then that gave rise to mating, territory defense, and everything that all these animals do. That's mind animal. And that's the third dimension of complexification. Okay, matter, life, mind on the base of energy information. That's, folks, where we're going to be focused on. And in addition, then what happened to us as primates, and we can go through the system. Oh, we got our 5 minutes. I knew we were moving fast. Okay, we try to create a boundary here, constraints.
We're trying.
And then finally, ultimately, you can go then through basically from crabs to chimps. And that's fast. But for about 500 million years, basically, there's the evolution of animal body plans and increasingly complicated brain structure as we go through fish into reptiles, into birds and mammals. We can talk a lot about that, but essentially there's an evolution of animal behavior at the descriptive level, properly construed as minded behavior. And then finally, we're going to get to us talking about our situation, reflecting, asking questions, answering, and building systems of justification. And that's going to take off about it. But certainly by 50,000 years ago, maybe as early as 500,000, there's good questions about exactly when, and ultimately get a culture, person, plane of existence. Okay? So the descriptive metaphysical system that we're, from a naturalist, what's nature? It's actually 5 different layers, energy information, 4 different planes of existence, matter objects, living organisms, minded animals, and culture persons. That third dimension points to us, there's mindedness in nature. It's a kind of behavioral complexification. It's what animals do from the outside, and it also is going to give rise to how we experience the world from the inside. And that's a basic description that's way clearer than, it's either matter or mind. It actually ontologically puts mind in nature. Okay. Well.
Beautiful, Greg. A couple of comments. So also for our listeners, so there will be some of the UTOK folks, Unified Theory of Knowledge, that are well aware, and they're like, great, thanks, I know about this. There are going to be other people who don't know. And so speaking to both groups, it's like really soaking that in, right? Like when I wrote a model of evolution and complexity pre-early internet, and I had to pull tens of dozens of books about chemistry and physics and biology and anthropology and psychology. And what I would argue is that what you're offering there in that descriptive metaphysics, in that tree of knowledge, is a very unified framework of it's a simplification, right? So for people, a useful simplification for what's happening in that science is messy, science is full of discovery. There's always going to be people arguing. No one's going to always agree, and that's how the field evolves. But for the rest of the lay folks, they can get lost in the details to the point the details are irrelevant. And so I would argue what you're doing is then saying, let's actually really zoom out. Let's look at big picture, unified frameworks that already exist in the natural sciences. We've started with a placeholder right now about mindedness and minded behavior and culture person, but to actually give that a place too in our model of reality, because in the absence of that, we're left with what people have historically done. Let's talk about natural sciences, and then mind stuff is just science is not going to go there. That's actually the world of arts and humanities, which also, by the way, is a beautiful place because minded animals can be creative, right? And they simulate. But to actually say, hey, no, let's actually find a way to put mind and culture and personhood into our natural sciences, essentially, like expand what we mean by that. And then I would argue, particularly as we're in a meaning crisis on the planet, this is, I would say, another, in my view, a bedrock of what can be built in terms of finding meaning again, right? And so to actually look at the world. Like, so you brought this out conceptually and did a great job. And I'm here to say to the viewers, and I think I know the variations of this have clearly happened to you, Greg, but it's like your mindedness changes, your experience changes when you actually look at, if you will, look at the world, right? So sometimes I can sit outside, so just bringing it like aesthetic to this, right? And look at the stars and look at the sky. And I'm like, wow, here's all this, matter,
Totally.
object, and energy, like energy matter transformations. And then, at least zoomed naturalistically to our planet. And I look out where I live and I see trees and I go, wow, those are living organisms, right? And then I see a squirrel run by or my cat walk by and I go, and here's a minded animal. And then I look at myself and then I go, I have all that within me, right? I'm made of matter and energy. I'm made out of the furnace of those ancient stars, right? I'm made of the carbon and nitrogen out of them. As a living organism, I'm looking around and I see other living organisms and we share the same dynamic ancestor. Totally. It's living through each one of us right now,
Right.
And then to look at the minded animals and say, because we'll get more into this, what does that mean actually to say animals have a mind or mindedness? And what does that mean? So I could talk about it scientifically from the external outside in, looking at behavior, but then I have this mental behavior I experience and to actually say maybe they do too. And then does that have any aesthetic or even ethical dimension if I actually all of a sudden look at animals as minded? Okay. And I can tell you, yes, it does. And then the same with a cultured person, to actually then look at other human beings and go, that's another cultured person. And they have justification systems that are embedded in them. And they are a node in a network of cultural justifications. Some people are aware of their justifications and their embeddedness in their culture. Many are not. But like to say that actually matters when we live in a time where there's all these culture wars, rather than just saying somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose. How do we find win-wins? How do we transcend and include? How do we, unify into a deeper, higher order, but also respect the differences? And by the way, if you actually start to see yourself as the stacked entity, as I've said, a focality of this totality to actually as an aesthetic, as an aesthetic, like it's changing who you are, right? And it perhaps changes your minded and cultural behavior. Perhaps, we'll play more into this, but I just want to double down and say this can be mind changing for people and culture changing to actually incorporate this. And I would also add, as I've run across this, as I've spoken with some of my students, some are, atheists or agnostic or actually quite religious, but smart, very smart people. And to actually say a model like this is just speaking to the naturalism. So I would actually argue you could be an atheist or agnostic or religious, and this could inform your cultural view and your relationship to reality, right? So I just want to highlight, I think this is, we have to spend the time to justify like how this is scientific and empirical, but then I want to make sure we add the meaning and the aesthetic, like this is really mind changing and cultural changing if people let this soak into their being. And I don't know if you want to riff off that or even talk about the days of the week as a way of reminding oneself.
Well, actually, I know we're just about out of time. We're trying to keep ourselves to that. So maybe we'll start with the days of the week next time, and then we'll also open up then this into the map of mind, because the whole question is, well, wait a minute, what about my phenomenology? How do I experience the world? And our point is going to be this map of behavior from the outside is going to get us quickly to the inside. We mentioned that the last time. So we can get it this inside out, outside in. And the other thing that you said is really super important. Okay. And that is sort of, if you hear what Baron is saying, is there's the science side of this. Okay. Which is, how do we make sense out of all the specific scientific knowledge that we have on the one hand, which is we're super refined, but also have a framework of what science teaches us about an ontological framework for the natural world. And my argument, and I think it's like tree of knowledge does this. Okay, there's a way to pull out an energy by time by complexification representation that stitches the general picture together to keep it whole, and then includes psychology and the social sciences in a new way. If you're wondering if it's a new way, go out and check big history. Okay, because there is that tracks this, which goes to this, but it doesn't even have mindedness at all in the original big history formulation. So it adds that. So at the level of what is our scientific consilience understanding, tree of knowledge is different. I argue that it gets into the theoretical things like psychology, like B.F. Skinner and Sigmund Freud and all that, ties that stuff. So it's a tighter scientific model, and that's important at a big picture level. There's a lot of specificity, but it holds a lot of that with coherence. And then the question is, does it matter to us, right? Does it matter I've got to go, I got a checklist to do today. It includes laundry and it includes, what difference does it make? Well, actually, I will, as a teaser, the day we're talking is God Moon Day. Okay, Sunday. Sunday's God Moon Day. And that is actually a time when, if you think about the transcendent and the potential and beauty and what you aspire to and what's possible, and maybe there's a God, right? Tomorrow is Void Darkness Day, where the universe will start over, Monday. And actually, I abstain. I don't eat on Mondays. I don't have sex, and I'm more likely to be bitter and pissed off tomorrow, and okay with that. Okay, so we'll pick up with the days of the week, and it will fill in energy, life, energy, information, matter, object, living organism, minded animal, and culture person. And we'll see the week, and we'll start there, and from there we'll then take, well, what is this mind thing as we zoom in on it, and we'll give you a map of mind. Mm-hmm. So, if we summarize, here we are, Mindedness Revolution, episode 2. There's a problem, an Enlightenment Gap. We need a new descriptive metaphysics. There's different layers of the world that we can track. Energy, information starts it all. Then matter, object, life, mind, life, living organism, minded animals, and culture persons. This is important for science, and it's important for our lives. And when we see the world with this big, broad behavioral view, we actually will also be able to see it inside out, and we'll pick up on that next time. And as that falls in, then we're going to see a whole new world.
Lovely. Awesome, Greg. As usual, super fun to talk, and I'm so happy we're doing this Mindedness Revolution.
Amen.
And much more to come. Again, for our viewers, our listeners, this will be a sequential process, right? So we're building the blocks. So as we get going, if somebody catches something later on, they may want to go back to the beginning. But this is beautiful. So
Sweet.
Look forward to more.
Yeah. Amen. All right. Episode 3 coming up next then.
Awesome.
All right.